They say you never truly know someone until there's a death certificate on the table and a pile of money missing from under the floorboards. My grandmother didn't just wait for my great-grandmother to take her last breath before she started picking the bones clean. She started while the woman was still fighting for air in a hospital bed. We're talking about over $100,000, hidden in jars, buried in the garden, and tucked away in the places only a mother would trust her own daughter to know about. Now, the money is gone. The secrets are buried deeper than the cash ever was, and I'm the one being treated like a villain because I refuse to sit at the Sunday dinner table and pretend my grandmother isn't a thief. How do you look at the person who raised you when you realize they're capable of stripping a dying woman's legacy bare before her heart even stops beating? They didn't just take the money, they erased a life's worth of work. And what's buried in our backyard now isn't treasure. It's a secret that's rotting our entire family from the inside out. And I think I'm the only one who can still smell it. To understand how we got here, you have to understand the woman we called Love. That wasn't just the nickname, it was her name, and she lived up to every single letter of it. If you grew up in our community, you knew Love. She was the woman who always had a pot of coffee on, even if she didn't know you were coming. She was the one who could make a dying rosebush bloom in the middle of a drought just by whispering to it. She was a pillar, a constant, the kind of woman who felt like she'd been carved out of the very earth she spent so much time tending. My earliest memories are of her in that garden. She had these hands, calloused, stained with soil, but so incredibly gentle. She'd spend hours out there, digging, planting, and, as we'd eventually find out, protecting her family's future in the most literal way possible. Love didn't trust banks. She grew up in an era where banks failed and people lost everything they'd bled for, so she took her security into her own hands. She was a saver, a woman of simple tastes who never spent a dime on herself if she could help it. Every extra bit of cash, every gift, every cent she managed to scrape together went into the vault. The vault wasn't a piece of steel in a downtown high-rise. It was the soft earth beneath the hydrangeas. It was the space behind the loose brick in the pantry. It was the bottom of a heavy ceramic planter that no one but her ever moved. Over the decades, that money grew. It wasn't just a few $100 for a rainy day. By the time 2025 rolled around, that garden fund had ballooned into something massive. We're talking well over $100,000. She didn't keep it a total secret, though. That was the beauty of Love. She was transparent because she believed everyone was as honest as she was. She'd pull my dad aside, or one of her other favorites, and she'd whisper with a twinkle in her eye, "Now don't you worry about the future. When I'm gone, you go to the old oak tree, the one with the knot that looks like a cat's eye. You dig down about a foot. That's for your house. That's for your kids." She had it all mapped out. She was literally planting seeds of wealth that she expected her children and grandchildren to harvest when she wasn't there to provide for them anymore. It was her final act of service. But then came September 2025. The air started to turn, and so did Love's health. It wasn't one of those quick, merciful exits. It was a slow fade. She ended up in the hospital, hooked up to monitors that beeped in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Even then, lying in that sterile white bed, she was still mentally there. Her body was failing, her lungs were heavy, but her mind was as sharp as the spade she used to turn the soil. She knew she was dying, and because she knew, she started making sure everyone knew where their seeds were planted. She was giving out the map, piece by piece, to the people she loved. Enter my grandmother, Sue. If Love was the sun, Sue was the eclipse. She had this way of making everything about her, even her own mother's impending death. While the rest of us were sitting in the plastic chairs of the waiting room, red-eyed and clutching lukewarm coffee, Sue was pacing. She wasn't pacing because she was worried about Love's oxygen levels. She was pacing because she was doing math. I could see it in her eyes, that cold, calculating glint that replaces empathy when someone sees an opportunity. Sue didn't work alone. She had my Aunt Shannon, her daughter, acting as her right hand. They were like a two-person demolition crew, but instead of knocking down walls, they were dismantling a woman's life while she was still using it. It started small, a check-in at the house to get some things Love might need. But they were gone for hours. Then those hours turned into entire afternoons. While my dad was at the hospital holding Love's hand, Sue was sending Shannon back to the house with a list. Love, in her innocence, had told Sue where some of the caches were. She probably thought Sue would safeguard them or help distribute them according to her wishes. She didn't realize she was handing the fox the keys to the henhouse. Sue didn't wait. She didn't even wait for the sun to go down most days. While Love was struggling to take a breath, Shannon was out in the yard, digging. She was in the house, moving furniture, peeling back rugs, and emptying out the jars that Love had spent 50 years filling. The betrayal really hit home when Love called my dad to her bedside. She was weak, her voice barely a whisper, but she gripped his hand with a strength that surprised him. She told him exactly where her gift to him was. She told him about a specific spot in the house, a hidden compartment she'd built herself years ago. She wanted him to have it now, to use it for the things he'd been struggling with. My dad, being the man he is, didn't want to think about money while his grandmother was dying, but she insisted. She told him it would give her peace to know he had it. So he went. He drove to the house, the key heavy in his pocket, feeling a mix of grief and gratitude. He walked into that quiet house, a place that usually smelled like cinnamon and old books, but it felt different. It felt violated. He went to the spot Love had described. He moved the panel, his heart racing, expecting to find the envelope that represented her final blessing. It was empty. Not just missed it empty, it was scrubbed clean empty. There wasn't even dust left. My dad stood there in the silence of his dying grandmother's house, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone had been there. Someone who knew exactly where to look. He didn't want to believe it. He looked in the other spots she'd mentioned over the years, the garden beds, the cellar rafters. Everywhere he went, he saw the signs. Freshly turned dirt that hadn't been smoothed over, scuff marks on the floor where heavy chests had been dragged. The property had been picked clean. $100,000 vanished into thin air, all while the woman who earned it was still breathing. And the worst part? My dad knew exactly who had the shovel in their hands. When my dad walked back into that hospital room, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the hour he'd been gone. His face was pale, his hands were shaking, and I remember him looking at Sue, his own mother, with this expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He didn't say anything right away. How do you? How do you walk into a room where your grandmother is literally slipping away and announce that the person sitting right next to her just robbed her blind? But Sue? She didn't even flinch. She was sitting there, stroking Love's hand, wearing this expression of practiced, tragic concern. It was a mask, perfectly applied, but for the first time, I saw the cracks. I noticed Shannon then too. She was standing in the corner of the room, scrolling on her phone, looking more bored than bereaved. And then I saw it. A smudge of dark, damp earth on the side of her sneaker. It was such a small thing, a tiny smear of the very soil Love had spent her life tending. But in that sterile, white hospital room, it screamed. It was the physical proof of the betrayal. They hadn't even bothered to wash the evidence of their grave robbing off their shoes before coming back to watch the woman they'd robbed die. The atmosphere in that room shifted from heavy grief to something much more toxic. There was this unspoken vibration of tension. My dad stayed quiet, mostly because he didn't want Love's final moments to be filled with the sound of her children screaming at each other over money. He showed more respect for her in his silence than Sue did in her entire devoted daughter act. He sat by Love's other side, his eyes burning with a mix of tears and rage, and he just held her hand. He knew the legacy she'd tried to leave him was gone, But he was still there for the woman, not the wallet. Love passed away shortly after. It was quiet, peaceful in the way she deserved, but the peace didn't even last until her heart stopped beating. The second the monitor flatlined, the energy in the room transformed. It was like a switch flipped in Sue. The concerned daughter was gone, and in her place was this frantic, controlling drill sergeant. She didn't cry. Not really. She made these loud, performative gasps, the kind of sounds people make when they want everyone in the hallway to know they're suffering. But her eyes remained as dry as a desert and as sharp as a hawk's. Within hours, Sue had taken over everything. And when I say everything, I mean she became the gatekeeper of Love's entire existence. She was the one who called the funeral home, the one who handled the paperwork, the one who decided who was family and who wasn't. And that's when the real cruelty started to show. You see, Love had an adopted daughter. We'll call her Maya. Maya had been a part of this family for decades. Love adored her, treated her exactly like her biological children, and had made it clear that Maya was to be included in everything. But Sue? Sue had always harbored this quiet, simmering resentment toward Maya. Maybe it was because Maya actually shared Love's kind spirit, or maybe it was just another way for Sue to exert power. The moment Love was gone, Sue moved to erase Maya from the narrative entirely. She gave strict orders to the funeral home. Maya's name was not to be mentioned in the obituary. She wasn't to be listed as a daughter. When Maya called, sobbing, asking for information about the arrangements, Sue would give her the wrong times or simply hang up on her. It was sickening to watch. We were all grieving, or trying to, but we were also being forced into this weird, silent compliance. Sue started getting angry at us, the grandkids, because we weren't going along with her version of events. She'd snap at us if we weren't acting sufficiently devastated in the way she wanted. Yet she was the one who was treating her mother's death like a business merger. She'd get this look of pure ice if anyone mentioned the money or the empty spots in the garden. It was a "we don't talk about that" situation, enforced by a woman who was holding all the cards. The height of the cruelty came when Maya asked for a copy of the death certificate. She needed it for her own closure, maybe for some legal things Love had set up for her. But Sue went on the warpath. She flat out refused. And when Maya tried to go through the health department to get a copy, since, she was legally Love's daughter, Sue actually called the department and threatened to sue them. She spent more energy trying to block a grieving woman from getting a piece of paper than she did honoring her own mother's memory. At the funeral, the performance reached its peak. Sue had organized the whole thing to center on her. She was the grieving daughter, the one who had sacrificed everything to care for Love in her final days. She stood at the front of the church, receiving guests like she was royalty, accepting condolences for a loss she didn't seem to feel. I watched her from the pews, and I felt this intense, churning nausea. I looked at the people in the community, people who had known Love for 40 years, who were coming up to Sue and telling her what a wonderful job she'd done. They didn't know. They didn't see the dirt on Shannon's shoes. They didn't know about the empty jars in the ransacked house. I looked at my dad, who was sitting there like a ghost of himself. He'd lost his grandmother, and in the process, he'd lost his mother too. Because the woman sitting at the front of that church wasn't the mother he thought he knew. She was a stranger who had traded her integrity for a pile of hidden cash. He knew, I knew, and Shannon knew. But the rest of the family? They started falling into line. It was easier to pretend Sue was a grieving saint than to confront the fact that she was a thief who had robbed a dying woman. What really stuck with me during that whole week was the lack of genuine emotion from Sue. I'm not talking about the stiff upper lip kind of grief. I'm talking about the total absence of it. She was busy. She was annoyed. She was angry. But she wasn't sad. She was moving Love's belongings out of the house before the funeral service had even started. She was sorting through jewelry, claiming things Love promised me, before the body was even cold. It was like watching a scavenger pick over a carcass. And the money? No one mentioned it. It was the elephant in the room that had swallowed the whole house. $100,000 doesn't just disappear without people noticing. But Sue had created this atmosphere of fear where no one dared to ask. If you asked, you were disrespecting Love's memory. If you questioned the timeline, you were attacking Sue while she was down. She used her grief as a shield to protect her loot. I remember standing in Love's garden a few days after the funeral. The flowers were starting to wilt because no one was there to whisper to them anymore. I looked at the spots where the dirt had been disturbed. I thought about all those years Love spent saving that money, thinking she was securing our future, thinking she could trust her own blood to carry out her final wishes. She died thinking her family was taken care of. She died believing her daughter was the person she pretended to be. The betrayal felt like a physical weight on my chest. I couldn't look at Sue without seeing the shovel. I couldn't look at Shannon without seeing the dirt on her shoes. And yet, the rest of my family, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, they all started to settle into this new normal. They'd say things like, "Well, it's over now," or "We need to move on for the sake of the family." They were willing to trade the truth for a quiet Thanksgiving dinner. They wanted me to just let it go and act like everything was fine. But how do you act like everything is fine when you know your inheritance was stolen by the person who was supposed to protect it? How do you sit across from a thief and pass the mashed potatoes? The pressure to conform, to just be nice and not cause drama, was suffocating. I felt like I was the one going crazy, because I was the only one who wouldn't stop pointing at the giant, gaping hole where our family's integrity used to be. The weeks following the funeral were some of the loneliest of my life. You'd think that the death in the family would bring everyone closer, but in our case, it was like a grenade had gone off in the center of the living room, and we were all just standing around, pretending we weren't covered in soot. Life started to resume its normal rhythm, or at least a twisted version of it. The seasons began to shift. The air turned crisp with the arrival of October. But the atmosphere inside our family was frozen. It was a cold, brittle silence that felt like it would shatter if anyone spoke too loudly. We had our first big family dinner about a month after Love passed. It was supposed to be a celebration of life, a chance for everyone to get together and share stories. But the moment I walked into Sue's house, I could feel the weight of what wasn't being said. Sue was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she basted a turkey, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. There was a newness to her that felt wrong. She had this air of quiet satisfaction, like a person who had just finished a very difficult, very profitable project. I looked around the room. My cousins were there, laughing at something on a phone. My aunts and uncles were nursing glasses of wine, talking about work and the weather. And then there was my dad. He was sitting on the edge of the sofa, his eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet, looking like he wanted to crawl out of his own skin. He knew. I knew he knew. But he was trapped in that ancient, suffocating cage of family loyalty. He didn't want to be the one to break the peace. He didn't want to be the son who accused his mother of being a thief. As we sat down to eat, Sue took her place at the head of the table. She began this long, winding monologue about how much she missed Love, how difficult the final days had been, and how she felt at peace knowing she'd done everything she could for her mother. I felt the bile rising in my throat. I looked down at my plate, watching the steam rise off the mashed potatoes, and all I could think about was Shannon's muddy sneakers. All I could think about was the empty, hidden compartment my dad had found. "It's just so sad," Sue sighed, dabbing at a perfectly dry eye with a silk napkin. Love was so disorganized toward the end. She always talked about leaving things for the family, but she was just so confused. It's a shame there wasn't more left behind for all of you. I really wish she'd been more careful with her affairs. The table went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the hardwood floor. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. She wasn't just stealing the money, She was stealing Love's reputation. She was painting her own mother as a senile, disorganized woman who had squandered her savings, rather than the meticulous, generous soul she actually was. She was laying the groundwork to explain why there was no inheritance, why the garden fund didn't exist. I couldn't help it. I looked up and said, "She wasn't confused, Grandma. She knew exactly where everything was. She told Dad exactly where to look." The temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees. Sue's hand froze with the napkin halfway to her face. She looked at me, and for a second, the mask slipped. Behind the grieving daughter was a predator, sharp, cold, and dangerous. "Honey," she said, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary concern that made my skin crawl. "Your father was probably just mistaken. It was a very emotional time. People hear what they want to hear when they're grieving. It's best we don't dwell on these things. It's disrespectful to your great-grandmother's memory to talk about money at a time like this." And there it was, the ultimate shield. If you mention the theft, you're disrespectful. If you point out the lies, you're attacking the grieving. My Aunt Shannon chimed in then, nodding vigorously. "Exactly. We need to focus on the love, not the material things. Let's just move on. It's what love would have wanted." I looked at my dad, pleading with my eyes for him to say something, but he just took a long sip of his water and stared at the centerpiece. He was broken. He'd been robbed of his grandmother, his inheritance, and his mother's character all at once, and he just didn't have the strength to fight the tide of the family's collective denial. The rest of the dinner was a blur of forced small talk and performative grief, but the more they tried to move on, the more I felt this burning need to hold on to the truth. I started visiting Love's house on my own. It was tied up in probate, but Sue had the keys, and she was already starting to clear it out. Every time I went by, I saw more of Love's life sitting on the curb in black trash bags. It was heartbreaking. The house that used to be filled with the smell of baking and the sound of old gospel music was being gutted. One afternoon, I found Maya, the adopted daughter, parked in the driveway. She wasn't going inside. She was just sitting in her car, crying. She'd been completely excommunicated. Sue had blocked her number, and the rest of the family had followed suit, afraid to cross Sue's invisible line. I walked over and knocked on her window. When she rolled it down, the look of pure, raw pain on her face nearly leveled me. "She won't even let me have a photo," Maya whispered. "There's a picture of Love and me at my graduation. It used to sit on the mantle. I asked Sue if I could just have that one photo, and she told me she'd already thrown it away." That's when I realized this wasn't just about the $100,000. The money was the prize, but the destruction was the point. Sue wanted to be the only one who mattered. She wanted to erase anyone who had a genuine, untainted connection to Love, because those connections were a reminder of what Sue actually was. By cutting Maya out, by silencing my dad, and by gaslighting me, Sue was rewriting history. In her version of the story, she was the hero, the martyr, and the sole heir to a legacy she'd actually dismantled with a shovel in the middle of the night. I told Maya I'd try to find the photo, but I knew it was a long shot. I went into the house later that day, using the spare key Love had given me years ago, a key Sue didn't know I had. The house felt like a crime scene. The rugs were rolled up, the furniture was tagged for sale, and the air was stale. I went to the pantry, to the spot behind the loose brick where Love used to keep her emergency envelope. I reached in, knowing it would be empty, but I just had to feel the space. My fingers brushed against the cold, bare stone. Nothing. Then I went out to the garden. It was a mess. Sue hadn't bothered to water anything, and the September heat had scorched the hydrangeas. I saw the holes. They weren't even well hidden anymore. There were patches of dirt that had been turned over and left clumpy and uneven. It looked like someone had been looking for buried treasure with a frantic, desperate energy. Standing there in the ruins of Love's garden, I felt a wave of anger so intense it made my vision blur. This woman, my great-grandmother, had spent her entire life building something. She'd worked hard, she'd saved, she'd loved fiercely, and she'd tried to leave a trail of breadcrumbs for her family to follow, so we'd never be hungry or afraid. And within weeks, her own daughter had turned that trail into a dead end. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was the fact that the rest of the family was letting it happen. They were choosing comfort over truth. They were choosing to have a nice family dynamic over holding a predator accountable. They started looking at me like I was the problem. I was the difficult one. I was the one refusing to let it go. "Why can't you just be happy we're all together?" my cousin asked me a few days later. "So what if the money is gone? It's just money. You're ruining every get-together by bringing it up. You're making Grandma Sue cry." "I'm making her cry?" I snapped. "She's the one who robbed a dying woman. She's the one who's threatening to sue the health department to keep Maya away. How am I the one causing the problem?" But they didn't want to hear it. To them, the problem wasn't the crime. The problem was the person talking about the crime. It was a classic case of family gaslighting. If you don't acknowledge the monster in the room, then the monster doesn't exist. But I could see the monster. I could see her every time she walked into a room wearing a new piece of jewelry, or talking about the home improvements she was planning for her own house. I could see the monster in the way she'd smile at me. A smile that never reached her eyes. A smile that said, "I won, and there's nothing you can do about it." I began to realize that if I stayed silent, I was part of the theft. I was helping her bury the truth, just like she'd helped herself to the cash. But the price of speaking up was becoming higher every day. I was being pushed to the margins of my own family, treated like a pariah for having a memory and a conscience. The transition from grieving to business as usual happened with a speed that was nothing short of whiplash. By the end of October, the shock of Love's death had been replaced by a new, more sinister atmosphere in our family. The era of the new rich. It started subtly, but if you knew what to look for, the signs were everywhere. Suddenly, Aunt Shannon, who had been complaining about her car's transmission for 3 years, was driving a brand new SUV. She claimed it was a miracle find on a used lot, but the leather still smelled like a showroom. Then there was Sue. She'd always been a bit of a bargain hunter, someone who clipped coupons and waited for the clearance racks. But now she was talking about renovating the kitchen and taking a much-needed spa retreat to help her cope with the stress of losing her mother. It was sickening to watch the blood money being laundered through the mundane details of their lives. Every time I saw a new piece of jewelry on Sue's wrist or heard about Shannon's weekend shopping sprees, I saw the empty jars from the garden. I saw the dirt under their fingernails. But the rest of the family? They seemed to have developed a collective case of selective amnesia. They'd admire Shannon's new car and ask Sue for advice on backsplash tile, never once asking where the thousands of dollars for these upgrades were coming from. The breaking point for me came when Sue called a formal family meeting. She said it was to discuss the final distribution of Love's personal effects. We all gathered in Sue's living room, which was already starting to look different. New curtains, a high-end rug, a massive flat-screen TV that felt like an insult to the memory of the woman who'd lived in a house with a rotary phone until the day she died. Sue sat in her new recliner, holding a clipboard like she was a CEO presiding over a board meeting. "Now," she started, her voice taking on that practiced, mournful tremor. "I've spent the last month painstakingly going through your great-grandmother's things. It's been an exhausting, heartbreaking process, as you can imagine. But I've done my best to be fair." She started handing out small items. A tarnished silver spoon here, a knitted blanket there. These were the legacies she was distributing. My dad was handed a stack of old National Geographic magazines that Love used to keep in the guest room. He took them with a hollow look in his eyes, his knuckles white as he gripped the glossy covers. "Grandma Sue," I said, my voice cutting through the performative silence of the room. "What about the accounts? What about the cash Love told Dad and the others was hidden for them? You mentioned she was confused, but the spots she described were clearly disturbed. Where did that money go? The room went cold. I could feel the collective intake of breath from my aunts and uncles. It was the forbidden question. Sue didn't even look at me. She kept her eyes on her clipboard, her pen poised over a list of names. I've already addressed this, honey. Your great-grandmother was a very old woman. She had a wonderful imagination, and toward the end, I think she started to believe her own stories. There was no buried treasure. There were no secret accounts. If there had been, don't you think I, as her primary caregiver and daughter, would have found it? But Shannon was at the house while Love was in the hospital. I pushed, ignored the warning kick my dad gave me under the table. People saw her digging. Dad saw the empty compartment. Are you saying he's the one with the imagination? Shannon jumped in then, her face flushing a deep, guilty red. I was weeding. The garden was a mess, and I wanted it to look nice for when Love came home. How dare you accuse me of something so disgusting while I'm still grieving my grandmother? You're being incredibly cruel. Weeding? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. In September? In the middle of the night? With a flashlight? That's enough, Sue snapped, slamming her clipboard onto the coffee table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I will not have this house turned into a courtroom. I have spent my life serving this family, and I will not be interrogated by a child who doesn't understand the first thing about the burdens I've carried. Love didn't leave a will because she didn't have anything left to leave. She was living on a fixed income. Any money she had was spent on her care. It was a blatant lie. We all knew Love's medical expenses were covered by her insurance and her husband's old pension. But Sue said it with such conviction, such practiced indignation, that I could see the others nodding along. They wanted to believe her. Because if they believed me, they'd have to admit that their sister and their mother were criminals. They'd have to blow up the family. And in our family, peace was always more important than justice. After the meeting, I caught my dad in the driveway. He was putting the stack of old magazines into the trunk of his car, looking defeated. Dad, you can't just let her do this, I whispered. That money was meant for you. For all of us. She's literally spending your future on a new kitchen. My dad looked at me, and I saw a glimmer of the man he used to be, the man who taught me right from wrong, before it was extinguished by a wave of exhaustion. What do you want me to do? Call the police? On my own mother? There's no paper trail. There's no proof. It was all cash hidden in the dirt. Even if I sued her, it would take years, and it would kill what's left of this family. I've lost my grandmother. I'm not losing my mother too, even if she is what she is. But she already lost you, I argued. The moment she took that money, she chose the cash over you. How can you sit at her table and eat her food, knowing it was bought with what she stole from you? He just shook his head and got into the car. Sometimes you have to choose which bridge to burn. I'm just not ready to light the match. But I was. Every time I saw Maya, the adopted daughter, I felt the fire growing. I found out that Sue had gone a step further in her campaign to erase Maya. She'd contacted the local historical society, where Love had been a frequent volunteer, and corrected their records, removing Maya's name from the family tree they were updating for the local archives. It was a level of petty, calculated malice that I couldn't wrap my head around. It wasn't enough to steal the money. Sue wanted to own the very concept of Love's legacy. I started doing my own investigation. I knew I couldn't find the cash, but I could look for the holes in Sue's story. I went to the health department myself. I wanted to see if I could get that death certificate for Maya. When I got there, the clerk behind the desk gave me a weary look the moment I mentioned Love's name. "Oh, you're from that family," she said, her voice heavy with professional annoyance. "We've had quite a few calls from a woman claiming to be the executor, threatening all kinds of legal action if we release records to anyone else. It's been a real headache." "She's not the executor," I told her. "There was no will, and the woman she's trying to block is Love's legal daughter." The clerk sighed. "Look, honey, we can't get involved in family feuds. Unless there's a court order, we have to follow the standard procedures. But your grandmother has made it very difficult for anyone to get anything without a fight. She's been in here 3 times this week alone, making a scene." That was Sue's strategy. Scorched earth. She would make the process of getting the truth so miserable and so legally precarious that everyone would eventually just give up. And it was working. Maya was too broken by grief and the rejection of her family to fight back. My dad was too tired. My aunts and uncles were too comfortable in their denial. I felt like I was standing on a sinking ship, watching everyone else argue about the color of the lifeboats while the water rose around our ankles. The more I pushed, the more I became the villain. I started getting concerned texts from my cousins. "Why are you doing this to Grandma Sue? You're causing so much drama. Just let it go. Love wouldn't want us fighting like this. You're being selfish." The irony was staggering. I was being called selfish for wanting the money to go to the people it was intended for, while the person who literally stole it was being treated like a saint. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, and it was working perfectly. Sue had successfully reframed the entire situation. The theft didn't exist, the money was a fantasy, and the only real crime was my disrespectful behavior. But then, I found something. It wasn't a jar of cash, and it wasn't a secret will. It was something Sue had overlooked in her haste to gut Love's house. I was in the attic, looking through a box of old Christmas decorations that Sue had labeled for the trash, when I found a small, leather-bound diary. It wasn't a daily journal. It was a ledger. In Love's neat, old-fashioned cursive, she had meticulously recorded every single dollar she had buried. The dates, the amounts, and most importantly, the locations. Holding that leather-bound ledger in the dim, dusty light of the attic, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October draft. This wasn't just a book. It was a confession from the grave. It was Love's voice, clear and unwavering, reaching out through the years to set the record straight. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, the meticulousness of it hit me like a physical weight. Love hadn't just been confused or imaginative. She had been an accountant of her own legacy. Page after page was filled with her neat, slanted script. June 14th, 2018. Put $1,500 in the blue mason jar, buried under the third hydrangea bush from the porch, for the grandkids' college. October 3rd, 2021. $5,000 in the metal box behind the loose brick in the pantry, for Shannon's mortgage help. January 12th, 2024. $10,000 in the floorboard compartment in the master bedroom, for my son. There were even entries for Maya. For Maya, my daughter of the heart. $15,000 in the attic cedar chest, hidden in the false bottom, to make sure she's always taken care of. The total at the bottom of the last page made my breath catch. $128,450. It was all there, every cent. And as I cross-referenced the locations in the book with the places I'd seen disturbed in the yard and the house, the map of the betrayal became undeniable. Sue and Shannon hadn't just stumbled onto some imaginary treasure. They had followed this woman's life work like a grocery list, ticking off the items as they pocketed them. They had taken the college funds, the mortgage help, and the Heart's Daughter gift and funneled it into granite countertops and new SUVs. I sat there on a stack of old blankets, trembling. I had the proof. I had the smoking gun that would strip the mask off Sue once and for all. But as the initial rush of vindication faded, a cold, heavy reality settled in. Who would believe me? Or rather, who would want to believe me? In this family, the truth wasn't a gift. It was a threat. My first instinct was to run to my dad. I wanted to show him the page with his name on it, to show him that Love hadn't forgotten him, that she'd tried to give him a future. I drove over to his house, the ledger tucked under my arm like a shield. When I walked in, he was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at one of those old National Geographic magazines Sue had given him. He looked like a man who had accepted his lot in life as a person who gets the leftovers. "Dad, look at this," I said, dropping the ledger onto the table. He didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched the leather cover. He recognized it. He'd seen Love writing in it 1,000 times over the years. As he started to read, His face went through a devastating transformation. First, there was recognition, then a flicker of hope, and finally, a crushing, soul-deep grief that seemed to fold his shoulders inward. He reached the entry for himself, the $10,000 in the floorboard compartment, the very spot he had found empty while Love was still in the hospital. He closed the book and pushed it away, his hand shaking so hard it rattled the table. "Where did you find this?" he whispered. "In the attic. In the trash pile, Dad. Sue was going to throw this away. She was going to burn the evidence that she robbed you." I expected him to be angry. I expected him to stand up, grab the book, and drive over to Sue's house to demand his inheritance. But he just sat there, a single tear tracking through the dust on his cheek. "She knew," he said, his voice barely audible. "She knew exactly what was in there for me, and she took it anyway. She watched me walk into that house, knowing I'd find nothing, and then she let me sit by her mother's bed and told me I was confused. My own mother. We can take this to a lawyer, Dad. This is a record. It's proof of her intent. We can get the police involved for the theft." "No," he said sharply, looking up at me with eyes that were suddenly terrifyingly hollow. "We can't." "Why not? She stole over $100,000. "Because if we do," he said, "the family is gone. Truly gone. Your aunts will take her side. Shannon is already an accomplice. If I call the police on my mother, I lose everything else too. I lose the Sunday dinners. I lose the holiday photos. I lose the only family I have left. I can't afford to lose my mother, even if she's a thief. I can't." I stared at him, feeling a mix of pity and absolute fury. He was choosing the shadow of a family over the light of the truth. He was willing to be a victim as long as it meant he didn't have to be an outcast. It was the ultimate victory for Sue. She hadn't just stolen the money. She had stolen their courage. But I wasn't my father. I didn't have 40 years of keeping the peace woven into my DNA. I took the ledger back and drove to the one person who had already been cast out, the one person who had nothing left to lose. When I arrived at Maya's small apartment, she looked exhausted. The grief had carved deep lines into her face, and her eyes were red-rimmed from weeks of crying. When I showed her the ledger, specifically the entry about her being the daughter of the heart, she broke down. It wasn't about the $15,000. It was about the validation. For weeks, Sue had been telling everyone that Maya didn't matter, that she wasn't real family, that Love hadn't cared about her. And here, in Love's own hand, was the proof that Maya was cherished. "She didn't forget me," Maya sobbed, clutching the book to her chest. "She didn't forget me." "I know," I said, sitting beside her. "And Sue knew it too. That's why she's trying to erase you. You're the evidence of Love's real heart, and Sue can't handle that." Maya looked at the book, then at me. "What are we going to do with this? If we show the family, they'll just hate us more. They'll say we're harassing them. They'll say you forged it." "Let them," I said. "I'm done playing by their rules. I'm done pretending that family means letting people walk all over you as long as they share your last name." The next Sunday was the big reveal of Sue's new kitchen. She had invited everyone over for a brunch to show off the marble island and the custom cabinets, all paid for with the money she dug out of the dirt. The atmosphere was festive, almost manic. Shannon was there, showing off her new car keys, and the rest of the family was oohing and awing over the expensive appliances. It felt like a celebration of a heist. I walked in with Maya. The room went silent the moment we crossed the threshold. Sue, standing by her new stove with a glass of mimosa in her hand, looked like she'd just seen a ghost. "Maya?" she said, her voice dropping an octave into that dangerous, cold territory. "I don't remember inviting you, and I certainly don't remember inviting people who have been so difficult lately." "We brought something for you, Grandma," I said, stepping forward. I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked right up to the new marble island, the one bought with my dad's house money and Maya's legacy, and I laid the ledger down. "I found Love's diary," I said, my voice projecting across the room. "The one you were going to throw away. The one where she wrote down every single dollar she buried, where she buried it, and who it was for, including the $15,000 she left for Maya. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the hum of the brand new refrigerator. Shannon's face went white. My aunts and uncles looked at each other, then at the book, then at Sue. The air in the room felt like it was being sucked out through a vacuum. Sue didn't even look at the ledger. She kept her eyes locked on mine. "That's a forgery," she said, her voice steady and venomous. "You're so desperate for attention that you'd fake a dead woman's handwriting? It's pathetic, really. You're sick." "It's her handwriting, Sue." My dad's voice came from the back of the room. He'd followed us in, though I hadn't known he would. He looked at his mother, and for the first time, he didn't look afraid. "We all know it is. I've seen her write in that book for 30 years. You know it's hers, too." "How dare you?" Sue hissed, turning her gaze on her son. "After everything I've done for you, after the way I cared for her while you were out living your life, you're going to stand there and accuse me of theft based on some scribbles in a notebook?" "I'm not accusing you, Mom," my dad said, his voice heavy with a new kind of resolve. "I'm just telling the truth. The money is gone. We all know where it went. You're standing on it." He gestured to the new kitchen. "You're driving it. You're wearing it." The room erupted, but it wasn't the explosion of justice I'd hoped for. Instead, it was a chaotic, ugly scramble for cover. My aunt started screaming that we were tearing the family apart. Shannon started crying, accusing me of bullying her mother. My cousin started shouting that we should just let it go because it's in the past. It was a nightmare of denial. They didn't care about the ledger. They didn't care about the proof. They cared about the fact that I had ruined the brunch. I had broken the illusion of the happy, grieving family. And for that, they would never forgive me. Sue stepped toward me, her face inches from mine. "You are no longer welcome in this house," she whispered, her breath smelling of orange juice and malice. "You and that woman," she pointed at Maya, "are dead to this family. Don't you ever show your face at a holiday again. Don't you ever call me. You've destroyed your great-grandmother's memory today. I hope you're happy." "No," I said, holding my ground. "I've saved it. Because now, we know she loved us. We know she tried to take care of us. You're the one who destroyed her memory by pretending she was a senile old woman who lost her mind. You're the one who turned her garden into a crime scene." As Maya and I walked out of that house, followed by my dad, I felt a strange sense of peace. Yes, I was the villain now. In the stories they'd tell for years to come, I would be the crazy grandchild who caused a scene and tried to steal from the family. I was the one who was obsessed with money. But as we stood in the driveway, away from the expensive marble and the polished lies, I looked at Maya. She was still holding the ledger, but she wasn't crying anymore. She looked like someone who had finally been seen. "What now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "we go to the garden. The real one. Not the one Sue dug up." The drive away from Sue's house felt like leaving a war zone where no one had won. The silence in my dad's car was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. He just gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, staring straight ahead as the suburban houses blurred past. He'd just stood up to his mother for the first time in 50 years, and I could tell he was waiting for the world to end. But it didn't. The sun kept shining, the traffic kept moving, and the only thing that had changed was that we were now officially the outcasts of our own bloodline. Behind us, in that gleaming new kitchen, the rest of the family was likely already circling the wagons. I could almost hear the whispers starting, the way they'd reframe what had just happened to make themselves the victims of my aggression. Over the next few days, the fallout was swift and surgical. It started on social media. Sue, who usually only posted blurry photos of her flowers, suddenly became a philosopher of family values and toxic boundaries. She posted a long, rambling status about how some people let greed poison their hearts, and how Sad it is when children turn on the mothers who sacrificed everything for them. She didn't name names, but she didn't have to. The comment section was a swarm of my aunts and cousins, all offering prayers and talking about how strong Sue was for enduring such disrespect. It was a digital shunning. I watched as my cousins unfriended me one by one. I watched as photos of family gatherings started appearing, dinners I wasn't invited to, bonfire nights at Shannon's house where everyone was smiling a little too broadly, as if they were trying to prove how much better off they were without the troublemakers. It was a campaign of psychological warfare designed to make me feel small, to make me doubt my own eyes and the evidence I held in my hands. But the most effective weapon Sue had wasn't her words, it was the money. Now that she didn't have to hide her new wealth quite as much, she started sharing the blessings. My Aunt Sarah, who had always been the most vocal about letting it go, suddenly had a brand new roof on her house. My cousin Toby, the one who told me I was making Grandma cry, was suddenly sporting a high-end mountain bike that cost more than my first car. Sue was literally buying their loyalty, distributing the seeds love had planted, but only to the people who were willing to look the other way while she stole them. It was a brilliant, if disgusting, strategy. By giving them a taste of the loot, she made them accomplices. If they acknowledged that Sue had stolen the money, they'd have to acknowledge that their new roof or their new bike was stolen property. It's a lot harder to be a person of integrity when you're literally sitting under the proceeds of a crime. So, they doubled down. They became her most fierce protectors, not because they loved her, but because they needed to believe her lies to keep their own consciences clean. Meanwhile, my dad was struggling. He'd lived his whole life in that small town, in the shadow of his mother's approval. Now, people at the grocery store would look away when he walked down the aisle. He heard through the grapevine that Shannon was telling everyone he'd developed a problem and was delusional about the inheritance. The gaslighting had moved from the living room to the entire community. I spent a lot of time with Maya during those weeks. We became a little island of two, the only people who still remembered the real love. Maya was still fighting the health department for that death certificate, but Sue's threats had worked. The bureaucrats were terrified of a lawsuit, and they kept hiding behind privacy policies and verification delays. "She wants me to not exist," Maya said to me one afternoon as we sat on her small balcony. "She thinks if she can keep that paper away from me, then I was never Love's daughter. She's trying to unadopt me." "She can't," I said, though I knew the legal reality was a lot messier than the emotional one. "Love's heart is in that ledger, Maya. That's the real record." But even the ledger felt like a heavy burden. I kept it in a safe at my house, but I found myself looking at it less and less. Every time I opened it, I felt a fresh wave of grief. Not for the money, but for the woman who had spent 50 years carefully planning a future that had been dismantled in a few nights by the person she trusted most. I felt like I was the guardian of a ghost's secrets. The atmosphere in town grew even more tense as the holidays approached. In our family, Thanksgiving had always been the big one. It was held at Love's house for 40 years, and after she passed, it was assumed Sue would take the mantle. The invitations went out via a group chat. Everyone was included, except for me, my dad, and Maya. It was a formal declaration of war. My dad tried to play it off like he didn't care. "It's just a dinner," he'd say. But I'd see him looking at the old photos of Love carving the turkey, and I knew his heart was breaking. He wasn't mourning the turkey or the stuffing. He was mourning the loss of the mother he thought he had. He was mourning the fact that Sue was capable of sitting at a table with her loyal children and grandchildren, knowing she'd robbed his future and his peace. And she'd feel absolutely no guilt about it. I decided I wasn't going to let them have the narrative. I started documenting everything. I made copies of the ledger and sent them to a family lawyer, not necessarily to Sue, because my dad was right. The legal costs and the lack of a paper trail for buried cash made a criminal case almost impossible. But just to have it on the record. I wanted there to be a file somewhere that said, "This happened. This was real." I also did something Sue never expected. I reached out to the local historical society myself. I brought the ledger, I brought photos of Maya and Love together over the decades. I brought the stories Love had told me about her life. The woman at the society, a kind-faced librarian named Mrs. Gable, spent hours looking through the ledger. She wasn't interested in the money. She was interested in the history. "This is a remarkable record of a woman's life," she told me. "It shows her values, her connections, her work. It's a piece of our community's story." When I told her about Sue's attempt to remove Maya from the records, Mrs. Gable's face hardened. "History isn't something one person gets to edit because they're angry," she said. "We don't remove daughters from the record just because their mothers are difficult." It was a small victory, but it felt massive. I managed to get Maya officially recognized in the town's genealogical archive as Love's daughter. When I showed Maya the updated entry on the society's website, she cried for an hour. It wasn't the $100,000, but it was a piece of her identity that Sue couldn't steal. But as the actual day of Thanksgiving arrived, the weight of the shunning became almost unbearable. I drove past Sue's house on my way to pick up my dad for our own small quiet dinner. The driveway was packed. Shannon's new SUV was front and center, sparkling under the streetlights. The house was glowing, filled with the warmth of a family that had decided that lies were more comfortable than the truth. I could see them through the window, my cousins laughing, my aunts carrying platters of food. In the center of it all was Sue. She was wearing a new silk dress, a string of pearls that I'd never seen before, and she was smiling. It was the smile of a woman who had won. She had the money, she had the house, and she had the family she wanted. A family of nodding heads and silent accomplices. She had successfully replaced Love's legacy of hard work and honest gardening with a legacy of theft and gold-plated deception. I picked up my dad and we went back to my place. Maya was already there. We had a small turkey, some sides, and a quiet playlist of Love's favorite hymns playing in the background. We tried to make it special, but the absence of the rest of the family felt like a physical presence in the room. It was like we were the survivors of a shipwreck, huddled around a small fire while the rest of the world moved on. My dad sat at the head of my small table, looking at the two of us. "You know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "Love always said that the most valuable thing she ever buried wasn't the cash. She used to say that the real treasure was the roots we grew in this town, the way we took care of each other." He looked toward the window, toward the dark garden in my own backyard. "Sue might have the cash. She might have the granite and the cars and the loyalty of people who can be bought. But she doesn't have the roots. She pulled those up the moment she took that shovel into the yard. She's living in a house built on sand." I realized then that my "Ate" moment wasn't about the money at all. It was about the refusal to be an accomplice. My family acted like I was the villain for refusing to let it go. But letting it go was just another word for lying. They wanted me to pretend that the theft didn't happen, so they could enjoy their new roof and their new bikes without feeling like thieves themselves. They wanted me to participate in the erasure of Love's true character, and I wouldn't do it. As the winter of 2025 set in, the divide in our family became a permanent geographical feature of our lives. There was the gilded fortress, Sue's house, where the lights were always bright and the driveway was always full of the people she'd bought. And then there was the island of truth, which was just me, my dad, and Maya. The holidays passed in a blur of forced exclusion. I'd see photos of their lavish Christmas, a 10-foot tree, piles of designer gifts, and Sue sitting in the center of it all like a queen mother. And I'd feel this strange mix of pity and disgust. They were celebrating with the ghost of Love's hard work, and not a single one of them seemed to mind the chill in the air. The strangest things started happening, though. You can't build a life on a foundation of theft without the rot eventually starting to seep through the floorboards. By January, the new rich energy in the family started to sour. It turns out that when you buy someone's loyalty, you have to keep paying the installments. My Aunt Shannon, the one who'd helped with the literal digging, started getting entitled. She felt that since she'd done the heavy lifting, She deserved a bigger cut of the remaining cash. I heard through the grapevine that she and Sue had a massive blowout over a loan Sue refused to give her for a vacation. The thieves were starting to turn on each other. Then there was the community. Our town is small, and secrets here have a way of surfacing like old shipwrecks after a storm. People started noticing the sudden influx of cash. They noticed the new cars, the renovations, and the way Sue suddenly stopped talking about Love's struggles and started talking about her investments. The respect Love had spent decades building was being eroded by the sheer tackiness of Sue's spending. People aren't stupid. They saw the empty garden beds. They saw Maya being ignored at the grocery store. The whispers started to shift from, "Poor Sue, losing her mother," to, "Where did all that money come from?" The paranoia started to get to Sue. She became obsessed with the ledger I'd found. Even though she'd called it a forgery, she knew it was real. She knew that as long as that book existed, her narrative was under threat. She started calling my dad, not to apologize, but to demand he return family property. "That book belongs in this house," she told him over the phone one night, her voice vibrating with a frantic kind of rage. "It's a private family record. You have no right to keep it. You're using it to poison people's minds against me." My dad, who had found a new, quiet strength in his exile, didn't back down. "The only thing poisoning people's minds, Mom, is the truth. The book stays with the person who actually cares about what's written in it. You already took the money. You don't get the memories too." That was the turning point for me. I realized that Sue was terrified because she had realized that money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy a legacy. She had the cash, but she was losing the story. And in our family, the story was everything. The climax of the whole ordeal came in February, on what would have been Love's birthday. Usually, the whole family would gather at her house for a big cake and a day of gardening. This year, Sue decided to host a memorial gala at a local country club. It was a black tie event, an over-the-top display of wealth meant to signal to the town that she was the rightful heir to Love's throne. She invited everyone who was anyone in the community. She didn't invite us, of course. But Maya had finally caught a break. After months of pressure and a letter from the lawyer I'd hired, the health department finally released a certified copy of the death certificate. And because I'd worked with the Historical Society, they had also provided us with a copy of the legal adoption papers that Sue had tried so hard to bury. Maya finally had the proof she needed to settle the small life insurance policy Love had left specifically for her. A policy Sue hadn't been able to touch because it required a signature Sue couldn't forge. On the night of the gala, while Sue was busy playing the part of the grieving, wealthy socialite, Maya and I went to Love's old house. It was empty now, staged for sale, looking like a hollowed-out shell of the place I loved. We sat on the back porch, looking out at the garden that had been so brutally ransacked. The snow was covering the holes now, smoothing out the scars Sue and Shannon had left behind. "I'm moving," Maya said quietly. "I'm taking the insurance money and I'm leaving this town. I can't breathe here anymore." "I don't blame you," I said. "There's nothing left for you here but the shadows of people who don't deserve you." "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "I have to. My dad is here, and someone has to stay behind to make sure the truth doesn't get buried under another layer of marble and granite." We sat there for a long time, just listening to the wind. For the first time since September, it felt like Love was actually there. Not the Love Sue talked about in her speeches, the saintly, silent mother, but the real Love, the woman with dirt under her fingernails who hid money in jars because she wanted her family to be safe. She hadn't wanted this war. She hadn't wanted her children to become monsters. But she also hadn't wanted the truth to be silenced. The next day, the AITA question really hit home. My Aunt Sarah called me, crying. She'd been one of the ones who took the roof money from Sue. She told me that the gala had been a disaster. Halfway through the night, a group of Love's old friends, the women she'd gardened with for 30 years, had walked out. They'd seen through the performance. They'd heard about the ledger, and they'd seen how Maya had been treated. One of them had stood up during Sue's toast and asked, "Sue, if Love was so confused at the end, how did you manage to find all her hidden savings so quickly?" The illusion had shattered. Sue had spent the rest of the night in the bathroom, refusing to come out. The family was now in a full-blown panic. Sarah was begging me to just call Grandma Sue and apologize. For what? I asked. For being right? For making it public? For letting the town know? We look like a joke now. People are calling us the grave robbers behind our backs. If you just take back what you said about the ledger, if you just say you were mistaken, we can fix this. We can go back to being a family. We aren't a family, Sarah, I said, my voice cold. We're a crime syndicate, and I'm not the one who made it public. Sue's greed made it public. Her new SUV made it public. The empty holes in the garden made it public. I'm just the only one who had the balls to call it what it is. She hung up on me, and that was the last time I spoke to any of them. Now, as I look back on that September, I realize that I've lost more than just a great-grandmother. I've lost the version of my family I thought I knew. I've lost my grandmother, my aunts, my cousins. I've been branded as the bitter one, the troublemaker, the person who ruined everything. They act like I'm the one who committed the crime because I'm the one who won't stop talking about it. They want me to move on and pretend that we're all just fine, that Sue is a saint and the money just appeared by magic. But I refuse. I refuse to sit at a table bought with stolen legacy. I refuse to smile at a woman who watched her mother die while she was busy counting the cash she just dug out of the yard. I refuse to let Maya be erased from our history. I know they think I'm the jerk. I know they think I should have put family first. But what they don't understand is that I am putting family first. I'm putting Love's actual wishes, her actual heart, and her actual life above the comfort of the people who betrayed her. If being a good family member means being a silent accomplice to a thief, then I'll happily be the villain of their story. The garden is empty now. The money is spent. The house is sold. But I still have that ledger. And every once in a while I open it and read Love's handwriting. I see the care she took. I see the love she had for us, even for Sue, which is the most heartbreaking part of all. Love died believing her daughter would use that money to build a future. Instead, Sue used it to burn the family to the ground. I don't know if I'll ever forgive her. I don't know if the rest of the family will ever wake up from the gilded trance she's put them in. But I do know this. When I walk through this town, I can hold my head up. I don't have dirt under my fingernails from a midnight heist. I don't have a new car bought with a dying woman's peace. I have the truth. And in the end, that's the only inheritance worth keeping. I've been told that I'm the one tearing us apart, but you can't tear apart something that's already hollow. I just showed everyone the cracks. Am I really the jerk for refusing to let it go? Am I wrong for acting like everything isn't fine when my own grandmother robbed her mother on her deathbed? Or is the real jerk the one who stays silent while the legacy of a good woman is picked apart by vultures? I want to know what you would do. Would you keep the peace for the sake of the family dinner? Or would you burn the bridge to keep the truth from drowning? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever had to choose between your family and your conscience, please share your story. We need to know we're not alone on these islands. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Sometimes the truth is the only thing we have left.